Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to another very crowded and well-attended APPG for Artificial Intelligence evidence gathering session. I apologise to all those who are standing that there are never enough seats in this place, but there are one or two empty chairs around, so please feel free to occupy those. Just before we move on to the substance of today, and for those of you who have got sight of an agenda, please do not panic. I am not going to do a 10-minute chair introduction. But that said, I do want to just say one or two things. Firstly, a continued huge thank you to the Big Innovation Centre for all their work, both within and without Parliament, on supporting, promoting AI in all its various guises. My co-chairman, Lord Tim Clement-Jones, and I were very fortunate to have been invited to Dubai last week. Was it last week or the week before? 2 weeks ago, to the Everything AI conference, which was absolutely fantastic. A real buzz around the place, and Britain was very well represented there, both in exhibitors but also taking part in the various panel discussions and main stage events. And the Big Innovation Centre certainly made its presence felt. And so we were certainly leaving our mark on that. But it was a very impressive conference. And of course, amongst the things that were being discussed is how we move from development of AI to deployment of AI. We know that that's already happening, but that is really what this evening is about. It is about how or what are the barriers to enterprise adopting AI. And that can be enterprise at every scale. We are fully aware that large organisations are already, well, we may be aware that large organisations are adopting AI, but we also may not be aware of how it touches our daily lives. And what are the barriers to expanding and promoting that and using it to increase productivity? But also, how is it that we communicate to small and medium-sized enterprises the opportunity that AI and machine learning and algorithms presents that could help streamline their business processes, could help them engage more widely with customers, serve their customers in a more personalised and stratified way. So there are lots of opportunities, but it's a question of what are the barriers and how do we get that information out to those small, medium and, as I said, large organisations, and what is it that governments can do to promote that, whether that's through regulation, through information, through advocacy, through championing the fact that Britain is a great place to do AI. And to help us explore that topic, we have 6 excellent speakers from a range of different organisations, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to do this. We normally tag team backwards and forwards, so perhaps if I get us underway and ask our first speaker to talk to us. Each speaker has 5 minutes, which normally takes 6. 7 if I'm really poor at chairing this, but I'm going to try and keep each of our speakers, as there are 6 of them, to 5 minutes, and I'll do a bit of a wind-up. But often they're in such, they're informing us with such great gusto that it seems a shame to cut them off. But so that everyone gets a fair share and that we get time for questions and answers, I will be fairly strict. But just before I introduce that, I realise I have missed something, that we have a new partner for the all-party parliamentary group, and that is Rialto, who are the... Three? Oh, sorry. No. Rialto Group. Rialto, Mega Group Limited, and Blue Prism. So thank you to all 3 of you for partnering with us. Right. On to the evidence. So our first panellist is Dr. Matthew Howard, who is Director of Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Analytics at Deloitte. Matthew. Hi, Matthew. Welcome.
Thank you. So my name's Matthew Howard. As you've heard, I work at the business end of AI, leading teams that actually build and deploy AI solutions, as well as work more in the advisory space. So in summary, investment in AI is clearly growing fast. We've recently published data in a publication called State of the AI in the Enterprise, which was a global cross-sector survey of around 2,000 IT and business leaders involved in their company's AI strategies. And they're both spending resources, investing into AI. And in that, we found that around 93% of UK organisations surveyed are currently increasing their investment in AI compared to last year, which is an interesting result. Despite this progress, the UK appears to be behind other countries like the US, China and Australia when it comes to moving beyond the prototype stage. The survey cites the biggest obstacle to this as being integrating AI into the company's background functions, background structure, roles, etc. And this problem is particularly local. These findings closely correlate with the integration challenges we encounter day to day as Deloitte when we work with our clients in actually deploying what we build at proof of concept or prototype stage into business as usual infrastructure operations. AI has a significant role to play in improving the performance of businesses, and particularly to help deliver scale productivity gains. To help UK companies overcome implementation issues and keep pace with our global counterparts, we see a pressing need to help them in 3 areas. We would say infrastructure, risk management, and workforce preparation. So to briefly go through each of those. Infrastructure. Underinvestment in companies' technical backbones is often an issue that is discussed within industry. It is easier to implement and to make AI work in a modern, well-designed, up-to-date infrastructure than it is to try and integrate into a very complex legacy one. However, that is often not the case. And we often find ourselves in the position where we're trying to make things work in a very challenging and complex environment. Organisations really have to try and build long-term sustainable enterprise technology roadmaps that are based on new technologies, such as cloud computing. The migration of organisations onto cloud will have quite an impact on how we can deploy these technologies. It's not just for AI as well. It really does provide the opportunity to move off some of these legacy architectures and into something that can really take advantage of all these new capabilities and services on offer. And of course, if you can operate on cloud from the get-go, it does reduce the cost of getting these things spun up. Risk management. In our survey, only 24% of UK executives said their company was fully prepared to address the potential risks associated with AI. This was the lowest rate of preparedness of all the countries we surveyed. The 2 risks that were that were identified as being most concerning were regulatory non-compliance and cybersecurity vulnerability, particularly surrounding the use of personal data in algorithmic decision-making. For many use cases, regulatory correct practice is relatively clear-cut. For example, if you're going to use a predictive model when deciding whether someone's entitled to a mortgage, so on and so forth, and in other areas where you're choosing the next movie to watch on a subscription service, it's relatively clear. But it does get more complex in a lot of different grey areas. And I think there is a role for government and the regulators in helping organisations understand what those areas are and to navigate that space. As an example, in our healthcare automation work, we have found the NHS Code of Conduct for the use of AI and the related 10 principles that support that to have been a very useful and intuitive platform, and that's helped us navigate through some of these areas. And we'd like to see this extended to other areas and industries, particularly critical for small and medium-sized businesses where compliance management can be a major overhead and cost and a time barrier to getting projects running. Similarly, around cybersecurity, one of the challenges to successful AI deployment is helping companies work out how both the correct regulation and the correct environment and security where they can actually test and run these things and actually try these experiments. And this is another area where we think there's probably scope for some help and guidance, particularly again in the SME space, to help companies be successful and safe in how they do these things. And then the final point we'd raise is workforce issues. 73% of UK executives thought their company has a moderate, major or extreme skills gap in meeting the needs of AI projects. We believe this is a significant barrier for many of our clients. Like all technologies, AI-based approaches require maintenance, such as regular testing and retraining, as well as deployment and building. And so to do this, companies need not only the right hardware, but also the right people, which is why it's important for them to both be able to retrain their employees to work in the right areas, and for example, more traditional IT to be able to take on some of these challenges, and also to find the right people and prepare staff to use them. Bridging this skills gap requires a reassessment of our education system and the future incoming skills into the labour market, as well as those already in work. This will require greater collaboration between academia, business and government, and more flexible in terms of courses and business incubation. We also think companies need best practice guidance on how to develop and source the skills and expertise they need. For example, for larger companies, this may be company-wide AI centres of excellence, boot camps, these sort of concepts. And then providing that infrastructure for smaller and medium enterprises could also be very valuable. Fundamentally, final observation, it really is that organisations of all sizes must address the enduring diversity issue that also sits at the heart of these technologies and truly make the field as inclusive as possible. And I'll stop there. I have no idea whether that is on time.
Perfect. Absolutely perfect. 5 minutes, bang on the nail.
There you go.
Matthew, thank you very much indeed. I just wanted to follow up with one question, and I think either Stephen or myself will be asking one question after each of the presentations, just to unpack it slightly. You talked about risk management specifically. What you didn't mention was the sort of sandbox concept, and I just wondered whether you thought that had a role, particularly the regulatory sandbox, obviously, whether that had a role in helping business mitigate risk by at least giving them a safe environment in which to start applying, developing AI that they wanted to put inside their business.
Yeah, no, I would completely agree with that. Any form of development environment, safe environment where you can test things is critical. What we often find is projects are dramatically slowed down by provisioning the infrastructure to run those sort of tests, even before you're remotely close to production. So any guidance or infrastructure help that can be provided to provision that, I think, is enormously valuable.
But are we moving fast enough in that area?
Probably not.
I see one or two wry smiles from the other speakers. No doubt we'll come to that, but that's something that it sounds to me as though we need to keep moving on.
One of the things that, and I'm sure colleagues will say something similar, is info security is obviously critical and deeply important, and is probably the thing that slows down everything the most. And obviously there is the information security in terms of cyber vulnerability, there's information security in terms of the letter of the law, and then there's information security in terms of perception and reputation. And it is an interplay of all those things. Often the latter can get in the way. People will rather mitigate risk by not taking any, by not knowing the regulation, which leads to things stopping before they even get started.
Okay. Thank you very much. Right, onward we go. And our next panellist is Shamus Ray. Welcome, Shamus, who is Partner, Head of Innovation and Investments at KPMG. And 5 minutes.
Only 5 minutes.
Only 5 minutes. Starting now.
Okay, right. Okay, so Shamus Ray, I look after AI strategy at KPMG and a few other bits and pieces. And actually, I would agree with a lot of things Matthew said in terms of where the industry is. I'd rather amusingly anyway, refer to the stages of AI development within an enterprise as play, the shiny toy syndrome, and then operational efficiency, and then business model change. And actually, we do a yearly survey of internal auditors. They are interesting people. That was humour, by the way, but okay. So internal auditors looking at where people are in terms of those stages. And actually, what we just found is, I guess, as Matthew was alluding to, not many people have moved into genuine operational deployment of AI, but about 50% of the internal auditors now believe their organisations will move into operational use of AI in the next 12 months. So we're starting to see a shift going forward. So I think that's quite interesting. We do believe passionately that we've got some great research in AI in this country, and obviously that needs to carry on and be invested in by government. But we do need to think about how we fold this into industry going forward. And I think we have 2 or 3 problems which stand out for me. Number one, I don't think the leadership of the various industries and the large organisations really understand the potential for artificial intelligence and the ramifications of that on their business models going forward. And so I actually think we have a leadership training problem right at the top of industry, which people don't really like to talk about. The second thing is there's a professor called Donald Sull, S-U-L-L, from MIT, who talks about something called active inertia. And he looks at organisations who go into the play mode and never come out of that, right? They don't move on to operational efficiency or business model change. And so people play at doing AI. So lots of organisations will go, we're spending X amount of money on AI, or we're investing in the following use cases. But they're not really rethinking their strategy in terms of AI. And the third thing is data, which is not a surprise to anybody. And in fact, we did a survey the other day, and only 35% of people in organisations believe their data is of any good. And I think that's a flattering number, right? Because actually, I haven't found a client who doesn't actually need to spend a huge amount of money on data. So what can government do to help? And we wrote a paper on our views around how the UK can be lead in the AI race. I have to say that just like an Arsenal supporter, we decided to aim for fourth rather than first, assuming that the US and China would come in first and second, and then questionably Canada, because of Professor Hinton, come in third. People can argue that. But actually, I think some of our recommendations still hold true, which is we should be thinking about the digital innovation hubs, which have been referred to before by government, and make them data innovation zones. And to actually make that work, and I think that's kind of some of the sandboxing type pieces we were talking about earlier on. We've actually been talking to some of the people in FS about creating a sandbox of FS data, which people can use for training and create new ecosystems around, just to support the fintech piece. But we're also working with all the accountancy firms, actually, and the association, to start looking at, can we create a common data model, a set of common data models around corporate data, and a data exchange platform which would allow people to, with a value-based system, have access to data, either to create digital services or to do trading on AI. And we're working with Microsoft on that as well. So we're going to do a lot more talking about that publicly, but over the coming weeks. But that is, without doubt, it's a cross-industry initiative in accounting, and we will go into legal later on. So think about it as trying to create the open banking for corporate services data. So that brings me on to the next piece, which is if we can do that and create data pools and use the government to get data innovation zones and start having industry views of data with proper common data models, all of which I think are achievable. I feel passionately that we can start creating new type of fintech environments for other industries, right? So, I work in professional services, accounting and legal, and I actually think we should have the world's best professional services tech, call it pro-tech, God help me, in the world. And why should Singapore be the leaders of legal tech and based on UK law? I've got no idea. So I think passionately we can do that, but that really needs government support, it needs data, it needs data exchanges, it needs academic work and the private sector coming into play. I would then say skills, but I think Matthew's beautifully covered that off. And then finally, I think the government really needs to help us change the tone of the conversation. The tone of the conversation at the moment is very negative, and we need to change to a positive job creation and not just London-Cambridge-centric view.
Thank you very much indeed. I don't know, Tim, if you've got a follow-up.
I just really wanted to follow up your data exchange ideas, Shamus. Really interesting. Is that partly a response to the kind of data monopoly issue that the Furman report identified, the CMA's now looking at and so on? Is there an issue, especially for the sort of small, medium-sized businesses, in terms of access to data?
Yes, 100%. And that's exactly, and we've made the CMA aware of what we're doing, as is the ICW, et cetera, and the FCA. The reality is that small organisations can't bring innovation into audit, tax and legal without having access to data. So how do we do that in a way which is going to be open on the market, allow lots of small organisations space to train AI and leverage AI, but also then have a common set of APIs which they can use to sell those services into big corporates. So that's exactly it.
Thank you. I just want to follow up because I think you were, I think it was in this room, we had our inaugural meeting in
either
November,
next door. Yeah.
November 2016, I think it was.
It was a long time ago. Yeah.
It was a long time ago, and you were here. And you were painting a very negative picture, I think, at the time about the impact this could potentially have on jobs. We talked about the fourth industrial revolution, we talked about 30 by 30 and 50% of jobs by 2050. Have you changed your view from that you said it would be unlike any other previous industrial revolution?
Actually, my view is still that the job turnover, rotation, is how I like to put it, is going to be enormous. And I think we are going to see 5 to 10 million jobs rotate over the next 10 years. The question is, can we create enough jobs to keep up with that? What I am doing is moving away from the dystopian-utopian conversation and go, how can we drive towards utopia and try and succeed rather than just focus on the dystopia?
Thank you very much indeed. I'm sure there'll be more questions around some of that later.
Especially about dystopia, yeah, absolutely.
Right, our third speaker, Ray Eitel-Porter, is that right? Ray, welcome. And you are Managing Director, Head of Applied Intelligence UK at Accenture. 5 minutes, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to give evidence. My name is Ray Eitel-Porter, and I lead Applied Intelligence at Accenture. We're a leading global technology consulting firm. I agree with all of the things that have actually been said already. I've got a few sort of additional builds on them and one or two similar themes. We ran a survey earlier this year of 1,100 executives, which showed that 70% of them believe that AI will have a transformative impact on their business, but only 45% of them think that they're actually achieving value today. So I do believe there's a big gap between the potential, what people see, and actually how you realise it, which is the crux of the question for this afternoon. We see three key areas to enable enterprise adoption for AI. The first is what we call human plus machine. So this touches on the point about what will be the impact on jobs. We do believe that there will be, in the medium to longer term, a net gain in employment from AI, but it's not going to happen of its own accord. So we believe that it's incumbent on organisations to proactively drive to maximise the potential of the new human augmented capability. And we need to be thinking about this as an augmentation rather than a replacement of humans. In Wilson and Doherty's book, Human Plus Machine, Reimagining Work in the Age of AI, they outline 6 broad categories of new job types, which we don't think about as organisations typically today. And I think that's a good starting point as to how we need to encourage new types of employment. The second area would be data. Both my colleagues have mentioned that. Another piece of survey information which I found interesting, Experian last year did a survey and they said that 70% of employees believe that they do not have the data they need to do their job as well as they could. And 30% of the data they do have is inaccurate. So there's a huge problem around the data, and fixing that is absolutely crucial for successful deployment of AI. And the third point is a mindset shift. A little bit to Shamus's point, perhaps, about leadership. We believe that you have to have a 10x rather than a 10% mentality to really get the value out of AI. Many traditional organizations are stuck in a sort of incremental approach to AI. They're looking for 10% improvements, 10% reduction here, 10% increase in whatever through the application of AI. We think you need to break out of that mindset and really think about where are the tenfold improvements or changes in your organization to really rethink how you do things through the use of AI. The question was posed as to whether there are different barriers by industry and by size. I think in terms of industries, as was mentioned, the regulated industries have already a requirement to make AI transparent and explainable. But I don't think that reduces actually the onus on every organisation to ensure that AI is explainable, because if they don't have the trust of their employees and the trust of their customers, people won't use AI, and therefore every organisation should be looking at building that trust and ensuring that AI is explainable. As for smaller and larger companies, I think currently larger organisations do have an advantage. Both in accessing the talent and the technology which is needed to really get the best out of AI. But I think that is likely to change in the future as we see a rapid acceleration in the capabilities of cloud platforms which are accessible through relatively simple tools and APIs. I think that will change the playing field. And the gap where it exists will be one of awareness. And there I think there is an important role for the government to play in raising awareness amongst small and medium-sized enterprises in what's possible and what is available. I chair a government task force into data skills, for example, and we focus a lot on SMEs and on the regions because we think that's where awareness needs to be built. And the final point was around other enablers for government. I think that encouraging an agile regulatory framework is very important, one that's perhaps akin to the way that GDPR has approached data and privacy, so focusing on the use of technology rather than on the technology itself. And we strongly believe that sandboxes are important and that more work should be done to rapidly provision FCA-style sandboxes to help organisations. We think that the government can encourage a global ethical framework supporting the work of the Centre for Data Ethics and Innovation, and really try and lead and shape the global conversation in that area, because we suspect that there will be a need for a principled approach to AI before regulation catches up. And then the final point would be in data sharing and access. That's undoubtedly holding back, and I don't think it's just holding back SMEs. We work with a lot of larger companies that are struggling with the ability to share data in the way that they would like to. So we would encourage more support for data trusts and encourage more work into privacy-enhancing technologies. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Excellent, Ray.
I mean, that is quite an agenda. I mean, in terms of quite a lot of it, it is changing mindsets, isn't it? And I very much like your maximising the potential of human augmentation at the beginning. I mean, but above all, I mean, that is, it's not pure, that's very much not pure business. There's a strong ethical dimension to that. I mean, how do you start going about actually bringing business with you in that?
I think absolutely it starts from the top. And actually, I've been positively surprised to see how many senior leaders in business do have a strong vision and do understand some of the potential. So I think it's actually that it's that next level in how you take the vision into implementation. And we've seen, for example, the further away that senior execs are from the front line in a business, typically the slower and the harder the business finds it to move forwards. If you have, let's
Getting
say...
a lot of nods at that. Great, thank you.
Excellent. Right. Let us move on to our fourth speaker, who is Kate Rosenshine, Head of Data and AI Cloud Solution Architecture, Financial Services, Microsoft. That's a bit of a mouthful, isn't it, Kate?
It is.
5 minutes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let me just unpack that a bit.
Yep.
So my name is Kate Rosenshine, and I head a team of cloud solution architects working across data and AI in financial services. So basically, we work with organizations, helping them understand how to actually get their heads around the data and AI space. So I'm just going to talk a bit about some of the trends we see across organizations, and this is not financial services specific. So one of the big trends is a shift of organizations that happens all over the place right now as they go from AI as a fun science project into something that is more enterprise and mainstream. And a large part of this transition has predominantly been driven by the need to establish the right mechanisms and guardrails to support these AI systems at scale. And actually, we're already seeing quite a lot of benefits from an AI-fueled world, a world in which we have more data, more computational power, and more complex algorithms. And this actually allows us to do new things at a scale that we couldn't really do before. So for example, some of the good things, because it's not all terrible, helping doctors find better cancer treatments, helping farmers grow more food using fewer natural resources, and also helping us detect malware and protect our computers against it. And as AI systems get more sophisticated and start to play a larger role in people's lives, it's imperative for companies to develop and adopt clear principles that guide the people building, using, and applying AI. And organizations understand that they must leverage AI responsibly, and this is to ensure public trust, which is key to their own success. But we shouldn't approach this new world with fear or a belief that we can't, as a society, solve the issues of liability. We've already done this with the motor car. And really what matters now is agency and the ability to do forensics and audit when things go wrong. So what do? I'll talk about two trends for leveraging existing methods to help achieve this goal. The first is learning from scientific methods, which are globally consistent. And second, a rethinking of IT operations and software best practices. So first, learning from globally consistent scientific methods. And the premise there of everything you do relies on protocols and controls. This premise creates globally shared best practices that ensure that new information being released has gone through some degree of due diligence by the scientific community. Though this is not always perfect, as we've seen recently, it does set some standards. And today, many organizations are adopting some of these methods for AI, and this is to support the evolution of internal approval processes that are a key to providing the appropriate guardrails for AI. And this includes establishing ethics committees and creating standards based on how we intend to apply AI into the products that we ultimately deploy. And this can be a good first step to ensure a healthy approach to oversight that can support innovation. But this in itself is not enough. AI in products for the real world needs to be developed differently from AI in science for a research paper. And now AI is much more accessible than scientific research is, especially with the rise of cloud computing. And we now have the opportunity to develop and promote similar global standards to ensure ongoing public trust in AI. So to my second part is rethinking of the role of software procedures in an AI world. And in many large organizations, DevOps, which is development and operations, is a part of IT that is responsible for building better applications at a faster pace. And this is a key enabler of the digital transformation, as many organizations increasingly face external pressures to be more agile. And with DevOps, they can actually improve the velocity of building and delivering digital solutions. So DevOps for AI is now becoming a key part of operationalizing AI at scale, as it allows organizations to manage their AI pipelines in a way that ensures enterprise standards. And this is a crucial step into moving from experimentation into industrialization. And with this in place, organizations can start tracking and auditing what data and libraries were used, how models were trained, and how products were defined. And in regulated industries especially, where documentation is a necessity, DevOps is a key step to creating more transparency and accountability in AI systems. And this is done through logging, testing, and creating guardrails, basically bookkeeping. Through taking best practices from engineering and applying them to AI technologies, we can audit and understand whether the intent matches the result and where the liability resides. So finally, as AI becomes more ubiquitous, we need to ensure that different organizations across sectors can not only reap the clear benefits, but also manage the responsibility that comes with it. Which is why right now, these two trends are an important part of the AI conversation.
Thank you very much indeed. Tim,
I just was very interested because the thought that was the bubble that was forming was had audit in it, and then at the end you came to talk about in a sense your new, I suppose it's new technology basically, is it that's able to deliver that kind of audit of whether or not the AI being applied is actually doing what it was originally intended to do, and how it's operating and so on. I mean, is it really the combination of ethical design plus audit that's all about? I mean, what's the essence of it?
Yeah, so I think it's leveraging systems that already exist and already are part of organizations, as we've had for years now in software development, and rethinking those and how they are applied to AI. Right? Because it's not just about the ethics, it's about basic responsibility of creating products that then go out into the world and need some sort of governance.
Purpose and so on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And especially now that we talk about data, the data part is incredibly important because, as we know, a lot of data is very dirty. So understanding what was actually used, which libraries, especially when you're thinking in an open source environment, which is great. However, organizations need the ability to then do forensics and say, well, how did we reach this conclusion? And we might not know everything, but I think right now, utilizing some of these pre-existing mechanisms and as a path of least resistance can be a good first step.
How do you get across the accountabilities, though? Because actually, I mean, who takes responsibility when you use some of this?
So I think organizations are ultimately accountable for the systems that they create, right? Just as in any product. You can't go and say, oh, the AI did it, and we don't know why, but it's artificially intelligent, so therefore it must know what it's doing. Ultimately, humans are responsible, and that also goes to the augmentation. As long as we have humans in the loop, with that sort of oversight, we can also create mechanisms for that accountability.
Sorry, Steve, carry on.
No, only that we're going to get to the Q&A in a bit, but just you've got a very brief point.
All the alarm bells go off when I hear somebody use the word audit, because audit, at least as it exists today, is very process-driven. Did you collect the relevant receivables? Not was their content right? Did they achieve the goal intended or whatever else? And I'm just wondering if you selected that word, because I can see the appeal of that very narrow process. It gives flexibility to companies to do a great deal, but simply say that they have audited what they're doing, and so I'm slightly concerned.
I think so. For me, it's more about doing forensics and being able to then go and see what was done. So auditing is a part of that, but I think having the ability to even have the information there to then go and audit or go and investigate in any way, shape, or form is a good first step. Because right now, that is something that exists in a very fragmented way across organizations. Meaning one of the issues, even if a company really wants to, do the due diligence, it just doesn't scale if each pocket does their own sort of thing. You have to have it industrial, and you have to have those mechanisms end to end. And yes, I'm guessing auditing is a part of that, because ultimately there is a responsibility of, the wider society to these systems.
Thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of further questions in a moment. But before we get to those, I'm going to move on now to John Byers, who is Partner, Head of Commercial at Osborne Clarke. John, welcome.
Thank you very much, Stephen, and I've listened with interest to everyone and the points they've had to say, so I will, and I've noted your strictures on timing, so I'll try and keep my evidence short for fear of the penalties.
I'm not that bad.
I'm a transactional lawyer for my sins, and what I'm going to do is hopefully come at this issue from the perspective of a transactional lawyer, so businesses that are transacting for artificial intelligence. Because what we're actually seeing is a battleground in the transactional field, and this is driving businesses down a particular path, and the adoption of deep learning AI or black box AI models is actually causing enterprise some concern. And basically, the thrust of my evidence will be: well, are there too many issues in transacting for these types of technologies, so that businesses will actually go for the path of least resistance and take a more traditional approach rather than using artificial intelligence, which I think is quite an important point. We come across the transacting for artificial intelligence essentially in four particular ways. So, firstly, fully packaged artificial intelligence and machine learning solutions, which are licensed in a similar way to on-premise software solutions. And you've got bespoke AI systems which are procured through development agreements. Fully packaged AI as a service solutions which typically would be delivered by businesses such as Microsoft and Azure. And then anything in between, so potentially an increasing trend is for businesses such as Microsoft and AWS to provide pre-packaged elements. So they might provide libraries of pre-curated data to clients or pre-trained algorithms, which are kind of a halfway house rather than a full solution. So what are the typical issues that we're seeing in this kind of transactional battleground? Well, the first is, I take slight issue in a very polite way with Ray on his comments about the GDPR. The GDPR, or the European Union General Data Protection Regulation, is one of the most riven battlegrounds when these systems are being transacted for. And that's particularly because I know it's technology transparent, but it is actually creating lots of issues, and I won't go into detail because of the time limits, but lots of issues in the way in which the legislation is actually framed, which make it very difficult for businesses to actually comply. I mean, I'll give you one in particular example, which is the Privacy Information Notice, which says that you have to provide meaningful information about the logic involved in the processing if you use artificial intelligence. Well, if you're deploying a black box solution and the data architects themselves don't really know how the system works because it's such a deep neural network, how can they possibly explain that to the average consumer in terms which are clear and concise, which is what the Article 29 Working Party says you have to do as well. So we're, frankly, with big business struggling to work out how they untie that Gordian knot, and we've had to come up with some very innovative solutions in partnership with some of our esteemed colleagues, not least KPMG, but working on, for example, layering, so that when someone clicks through to understand how the technology works, they're clicking into progressively deeper levels of detail if they actually want to get to that. And there's still no guarantee that that is actually compliant with the GDPR because no one's actually tested it yet. So we've talked at length about data. And obviously data quality is a huge issue, and standardisation, consistency across the piece, and I fully accept that. But the other battleground is ownership for data. It's a much simpler battle, and we are seeing this time and time again. Businesses wanting to own the data and not really understanding the way these deep learning, machine learning systems work. So, in the retail space, for example, we act for a robotics provider that is putting robots into supermarkets, and the retail sector is very hard-edged, so the big format supermarkets want to hold all the data. So what they're trying to do is effectively undermine the business model of the robotics provider, which is a big issue for them. Inevitably, I'm going to be talking about liability for failure of black box models. Again, this is uncertain territory for us, and I think, frankly, what the debate devolves into is a very crude exchange between suppliers and customers about who's going to carry the can if things go wrong, and it devolves into a debate about who has the most bargaining power. So, if the big supermarket has the bargaining power, then they can push all the liability onto the small supplier. If the supplier is giving us Microsoft, then Microsoft can turn the tables the other way. IP ownership is another very similar battle, and I'm again conscious of Stephen's strictures, so I'll keep it brief. But again, businesses looking to retain the rights of these systems that are pre-trained, when in fact possibly that should be held by the suppliers that are supplying the systems. And finally, I would like to kind of talk about empirical verification and testing, which I think is a huge issue, because what we're seeing here is businesses being asked by suppliers to take machine learning systems and asking for guarantees as to the performance of these systems, and the suppliers turning around and saying, well, actually we can't provide an SLA because we don't know how actually the thing's going to work. There is a degree of variability. I won't go into detail. There's a degree of variability potentially about deep learning models, which potentially means that they could come up occasionally with edge case decisions, and sometimes it's very difficult to tune those edge case decisions out of the outputs of those systems. And what that means is that if you're in an FCA regulated environment and you want those guarantees, you're not going to get them if you're using deep machine learning. So this is why financial services businesses are knee-jerking more towards traditional technology. So that essentially is what I'm going to say. I think I fully support what the House of Lords Select Committee says about getting the Law Commission to talk about or to investigate more what the law can do and how the law can be changed, and you expect a lawyer to say that. But I also think the CDEI should be prioritising a consistent ethical code for SMEs and actually all businesses in the UK for use of these technologies.
So while we're working out some of that challenge through, GDPR covers a whole load of stuff. It does include the ability to challenge and get an explanation, but it probably wasn't designed when it set out to be able to do that. Do we need to take a more pragmatic approach and actually have a two-track, maybe multiple-track approach, that where the decision being made is critical, that there is a human alternative pathway, that you don't try and justify why your AI has done something, you create an alternative track while we work out how we're going to be able to demonstrate why an AI has done something. It matters when I'm applying for a mortgage. It doesn't matter so much because it's showing me something totally inappropriate on a subscription television network.
Yeah, no, I understand that, Stephen, but then isn't that inherently limiting the use cases for the technology? I mean, in many situations, the technology is needed and can provide an undoubted benefit because it does provide a fast track that helps people. It makes it self-limiting, doesn't it?
But if you can't get an explanation, it's what I'm saying. And from a constituency MP's point of view, I have had constituents who have been refused various things via an AI and we can't get an explanation. And that doesn't seem satisfactory at the moment. So we need a workaround, I suppose is what I'm saying. Tim, I don't know if you want to add anything, or should we...
I think I'd love to ask you the wider question about whether we actually need a new legal framework. In a sense, you're implying that these contracts are of a different order. They're not, like the old software contracts. AI poses completely new and much bigger issues, and therefore we need a new framework by the sound of it.
Well, I wouldn't go so far as a new framework, Tim, but I think we certainly do need to increase the Law Commission's priority on looking at some of these issues, because at the end of the day, what's happening is that enterprises are just using commercial contracting as a battleground, and there's a lack of consistency across the piece. And I think it's down to legislators to create that consistency.
Thank you. Right. Our final contribution comes from Tim Gordon, who is founder and partner at Best Practice AI. Tim, over to you. 5 minutes.
Well, thank you for having me. I suspect that probably we're the only organisation at this table that needs some introduction, given the august nature of my colleagues here. Best Practice AI is a recent startup founded to help try and find and deliver competitive advantage for organisations through using AI. I'll touch on two things we've done. The first is we built and published what we think is the world's largest set of use cases and case studies on how you can use AI. So we got 1,200 case studies in there at www.bestpractice.ai. And looking across the mix of those, what you can see very clearly is you look at the UK case studies, they're actually a very similar mix of functional and industrial sector case studies as you get, for example, in a potentially more advanced place like the US. So to some extent, the high level is very similar. The underlying economic impact, though, is very different. So you're seeing a far bigger economic impact from very similar case studies as deployed in the States. The second thing we're doing is we've been working with the World Economic Forum. We've helped them write their AI board toolkit. And last week we were delighted to announce we were the first UK AI firm to be invited to join the Global AI Council of the World Economic Forum. So that's bestpractice.ai. I'm obviously going to touch on a lot of the same subjects as my colleagues. The first one I think I'd just say is various people here have referred to various studies they've done on AI adoption. The simple fact is we do not know. So far as I'm aware, there's not a single actual sort of full, if you like, sort of scientific as opposed to self-selected study on who's using AI in this country. So we've no idea by sector, by industry, by region, by size of company. We don't really know. We know what a bunch of self-selected CIOs think they're doing. It's not the same thing as actually knowing where the country's at. And I think when you think about government policy, that's quite a big issue. The second big issue that people have touched on is executive education around AI. And there's a couple of issues here. The first, clearly, is that, if you like, the poster child for the AI industry is the shiny silver robot man walking around in an article. And the problem with that is, A, it sort of gives people complete confusion as to what the point of AI is, but secondly, it also drives the wrong economic discussion, because it forces people to think about AI as replacing humans as an automation task, as opposed to, as some of our colleagues have talked about, the way in which it can transform economic and business models. The real benefit of AI is it's going to enable companies to stop having to make big trade-offs between scope, scale, and speed. And that's something that someone like Amazon is using AI for, and that's the really big opportunity that we're going to miss if we focus on shiny silver robot men. Third, obviously, is access to talent. People have talked about that. I think that's moving. So the country's doing a fair bit now in terms of getting more data scientists trained up. But we're still desperately short on data engineers, and we're still short on, if you like, sort of mid-level managers who really get what the issue is. In a lot of organisations we're seeing, the chief executive sort of is walking around in a haze of pixie gold dust that the AI will deliver. There's probably an innovation team who strongly believe this is fantastic. And in between, there's a mass of the organisation going, it's a bit more complicated than that. And so how do we get through some of those issues? The fourth one is obviously around data, and the whole issue around data is the absolute critical issue of this. The data is the real estate of the 21st century when it comes to AI. And so getting this nailed down, getting in the right place is a real big challenge here. And I think this is an area where, for example, we've got a lot of startups having problems. They need, and I think our last speaker spoke very eloquently about this, startups need access to B2B data. They're struggling to get it. It takes a long time to get those deals in place. And that's one of the issues that's going to cause a real, I think, survivability challenge for some of our startups as they spend the time getting that data on board. And obviously, the data available defines what gets made. So to some extent, the AI that's being delivered at the moment is very much driven by the vendor plans, what the vendor wants to do, as opposed to what an organisation strategically should want to do. So that's quite a big issue in terms of looking forward in terms of take-up. The fifth thing, and I think people have talked about this in different ways, is breaking out of what we call the proof of concept zone, where everyone's sort of, you described it as the fun stuff, but people are basically doing proof of concepts to learn inside on what they can do in AI. And turning that into an operational, fully productized tool that can be used across the organisation is a huge issue. So to quote a study, 95% of US executives quite close to this in the financial services sector believe the core challenge getting to the next level is not technological, it's not even data, it's a sort of operational change management, big cultural shift that needs to happen, and that's a really big issue. And we think the organisations that are probably furthest on this are organisations that have a burning platform. So if you contrast what Ocado is doing in terms of using, as part of a bigger spectrum, AI to transform their business and their entire value chain, they clearly are a business that their original business was perhaps more challenged than, say, Tesco, which has done very well in the last generation of the supermarket wars, and now takes, as I understand, about 9 months to sign off on a POC sort of deal with a startup. So you see a very big difference here. That same startup, by the way, did a similar proof of concept deal with the Ministry of Defence in 6 weeks. So you get some sense on how that big cultural shift in organisations needs to keep going. And finally, and I think there's a bigger issue here, there's a whole trust question, which is just beginning to emerge. And as we talk about ethics and so on, this is causing all sorts of issues which will delay people making internal decisions to get into the right sort of place. So what can the government do? Firstly, I think the government should be sitting down and tracking this properly. I don't think it's a particularly expensive task. YouGov can probably do it for a few tens of £1,000s. But it'd be good to know where the UK is at and compare that with some comparable markets to understand really, are we first, second, third, fifth or seventh? Who knows? Second, I think the big issue is around driving executive education. How do we really get people rethinking what some of these issues are? And tied to this, I think, is the simple question around, which is an issue we'll have again and again in the UK, around what are executives incentivised on? So in the UK, executives are typically incentivised on this year's cycle or this year's results. And actually, a lot of this AI transformation takes 3 to 5 years. It's not an overnight thing. So are we making sure people are incentivised to really get to the right place on this? Third, and I think this is a big issue, it's a bigger issue than just this, which is China is using AI to transform its whole world around social control and internal security. The US is using AI to basically establish the fact that the 7 or 10 most profitable companies, valuable companies in the world are US. They're doubling down on that. What is the UK doing of a similar scale that justifies people really putting the effort behind it? And until we can really think through what the UK is doing, the mission and the sense of what we're trying to achieve, we're going to struggle to compete in a world where some of the big players are basically thinking this is an arms race and they're racing at it. Fourthly, I think there's a lot of, the government's doing a lot of great stuff, but to some extent, they're pouring a lot of institutions out there. We need to make sure we've got perhaps fewer institutions, properly resourced to deliver. And the final point, forgive me, is that I think a lot of this is going to mean that there's a bit of a hype bubble in AI at the moment. In a few years' time, it may well be there's no self-driving cars, the shiny silver robot man doesn't quite exist, and a whole bunch of people will go, well, what was all that hype about? Now, to some extent, that will feel a bit like the dot-com 2000 moment. In 10 years' time, it will transform the world. Can the government keep investing through that tough bit? Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent questions there for the government. I think we'll need to take those on. But that's the purpose in these. It does give us some practical guidance as to what we should recommend to government. I think there's lots of questions in there, but I'm conscious of time as well. And so I think we need to move on apace. Now, just before I do throw it open for questions, we have a presentation from Sofia Ihsan.
Well done.
Thank you. Who is trusted AI Lead UKI, Ernst Young. Sophia.
So hello everyone, I've been introduced. So I agree with much of what's been said by the other panellists, but I'm going to come at this from a slightly different angle. So regardless of having the right data, the right skills and the right infrastructure, if users, employees and organisations don't trust it, surely that will be a barrier to adoption. In terms of how you build trust, the broad consensus is 4 conditions. It should be ethical, compliant with social and ethical norms. It should be fair, unbiased, transparent, even respectful. It should have a level of social responsibility, both at the local and macro level, taking into account the financial, the mental, and the physical welfare of human beings and the natural environment. There ought to be accountability, so a clear line of accountability to an individual. There needs to be clarity over the data that's used and over the decision frameworks that it's using, so data, algorithms and people. And finally, it needs to be resilient. Resilient in terms of, does it continue to operate in the way we intend it to operate as it evolves its decision framework over time? And the other thing that we really need to embed and understand when dealing with artificial intelligence is it's probabilistic in its very nature, which means sometimes it will be wrong. So in terms of building that trust and facilitating adoption, not only do we need to have robust controls throughout the development to make sure it's fit for purpose and it's accurate and it complies with regulatory and legal requirements, but we need to have robust controls to help identify, challenge and correct when it's wrong and give people the ability to do that. At EY, some of our early learning from running our trusted AI framework, which is governance, controls, and then looking at trust gaps across industries and across use cases, the themes are actually common. I'll quickly run through those. So we're finding there's no overall ownership or governance over the use of AI. Organisations don't always know where it's being used or built, therefore not real clarity on the risks that are emanating from it and that they're being managed appropriately. So how can you build that trust in those situations? Secondly, while there's consideration of ethics, often at intervals, there's often no formalised, accessible, up-to-date ethical policies and standards like an ethical code of conduct or ethics training for the people that are building this, or even ethical design principles. So then how do you, after the event, prove that it was built ethically and actually the way that you're using it and what it's doing is ethical? We talked about explainability. Organisations don't always think about the level of explainability they're going to need for their particular use case to demonstrate that what it's telling you is based on sound logic, it's unbiased and treats users equitably. Also monitoring to make sure it continues to do what it's supposed to do. And finally, third party. So in building artificial intelligence, often third party components are used, and whilst organisations might have quite mature procurement processes, there are additional considerations when buying AI components. So were they built ethically? Are they biased? And do they work? And for which populations or which group do they not work as well as for others? And what do we need to do to mitigate against that? So if you look at then our findings and compare them to how you build trust, you can see there's some gaps there. So in conclusion, we accept this is an evolving area. We know that the regulation, etc., is lagging the technology, but as the responsibility and power that we're entrusting to AI is increasing, we need to have a set of guiding principles to build that trust and confidence. But conversely, without that trust and confidence, users might be unwilling to share the data that we need to innovate and progress. So I guess in conclusion, our recommendation is accelerating that guidance as a matter of priority.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So we've had 7 contributions, a lot of information in there, and we've now got approximately 25 minutes for questions because I was too lax in keeping everyone to time. But we'll make good use of that. So we'll keep them as questions, not statements, if I may. And if you could just indicate in the usual way, but say who you are and where you're from, and then ask a question rather than make a statement. Stephen.
Thank you very much. Stephen Croft, Bishop of Oxford, and on the board of CDEI. So noted all those comments. I wonder if you could comment a little on the role of the interface between universities and the corporate sector in all of this, because it seems to me, observing from the university end in Oxford, that universities are playing an increasingly critical role, and actually we may need new forms of partnership as well as new forms of institution and ways of collaborating between different sectors. And certainly the UK sector doesn't seem as advanced as some parts of the world. I'm thinking in particular of the German way forward in this. But it'd be good to hear from you on that.
Perhaps one or two? Yes, please.
So, yes, it's something that we've talked about in the Data Skills Task Force as well. Excuse me, I think that the university role is absolutely critical. The Turing Institute, I think, is a very welcome development in the UK. And more flexibility, I believe, is needed in terms of how academics can work with industry and vice versa. We don't want to have the situation where academics sort of have to choose which way they're going to go. If we can encourage and facilitate a much more flexible collaboration between the two parties, I think that would be very strong and very good for the UK.
Thank you.
Shamus?
Yeah, just to say, I refer to the data exchange platform which we're working on. And actually, we're working with one university on the actual security and data piece, and trying to work with their researchers around that as well. One university, which is Imperial, around future of accounting and how they will be able to leverage that data exchange network to build an ecosystem of startups. And we're just about to announce a university we're working with around the future of legal in the same respect. So I think we can have committees and whatever else, but actually I think we now have to have direct conversations and a common purpose. So we need to have some research around AI and accounting, and we want to build an ecosystem of competitors to us. How do we go away and get that done? So it's far kind of narrow and focused. So.
Thank you. Yes, and then I'll take a question here and then over there.
So this is almost picking up on the question I asked before. Look, I'm a cynic. I know no area of life where that weakness isn't exploited, strength isn't used, that's to advantage, where there isn't thirds over time, certainly all kinds of abuse. That's because it's so profitable to do so. How are you going to create this world of trust that enables you to go forward, particularly when the world you describe has almost no transparency in it?
Oh, let's start with that. I think if I get you correctly, the essence of your question is towards sharing. So if trust kind of imputes a level of sharing. I think someone in the panel talked about data trusts, which I think are a very important mechanism. And I think what a data trust does, and this feeds directly into the testimony that I gave earlier, is it creates a standardised platform for the exchanging of data as between potentially business and academia. It creates a standard framework which I think promotes trust and also makes it easier for these businesses and enterprises to share. And I think, frankly, enterprise will go with the path of least resistance. If it's easier to put their data into a data trust and it means that parties will share, then they're going to do that. That would be my view.
Can I just add something? Because we did a YouGov poll, actually, on trust. We interviewed 2,000 people up and down the country, and nobody trusts anybody in this country, I have to tell you. And the number one group of people they will trust is the NHS. Second is banks at 46%, and everybody else is down at 10%. Obviously, had we asked about KPMG, that would have been 90%. But the lack of trust means that actually what you can't do is break that chain of trust. We need to be really clear about what we're using consumer data for. And if we are the NHS, we can't just give that to an internet company because it will break the chain of trust. And I think we aren't having that proper conversation with people about trust. But I do think people will find ways of, to your point, bending the incentive program to profit. So we need to be keeping an eye on that. I'm cynical too.
Without presumably over-regulating and killing.
Well, I just wondered if the lady from EY might just comment on it, because it seemed to me that was really naive. I don't mean to be personally crude, but I just didn't understand how any of that was going to work in practice. And it comes looking at the audit system. I mean, it is hardly worth the paper it's written on.
Will the auditors take a ban?
I'm going to walk the steps back.
I'm not an auditor, so...
No, I'm all right.
Yeah. So, in terms of building that trust, it's looking at it from end to end, every single part of it. What are the risks here? And how are they being managed? And how does that link to the trust principles? So where did we get the data from? Do we have any gaps in the data? Is it going to introduce any bias? It's looking at that all the way through the life cycle and managing that to build and demonstrate that trust. So you can demonstrate that trust.
Okay, thank you. Question?
I'm Christine Chow, and I am a member of court and governor of the London School of Economics. I work in a financial services firm, and I'm a member of the data governance of APPG AI. So I hope that will allow me to ask three-parts question. The first one is related to the academic. I think there's been a lot of discussion on black box, and about 10 years ago, it works very well for companies because once you say it's black box, nobody asks any questions because nobody wants to look stupid. But nowadays, we do not accept black box anymore, and a lot of it is not black box. If you, based on my own experience, if you ask an AI company, what methods are you using? Cluster analysis, what are the additional techniques you use in checking maybe data visualization? How is it going to help you to minimize bias? They will answer that question. So maybe there is something needs to be done at the level of those who actually ask the questions. How are they going to equip themselves to ask the right questions to break that black box? And I think that should be the expectations.
Shall we answer that and then see if there is time for your other two questions? Otherwise,
my question is, how is in the UK, because in the US, for example, the expectability has been addressed in the US at university. Princeton University, for example, Institute of Advanced Studies, have been teaming up with companies to push the boundary of mathematics to do that. MIT as well. What are we doing in the UK universities to enable that to happen? Because that is going to help the whole AI system, not individual companies, to understand.
That is a good question. Well, I think we should answer that because otherwise, and let's see who else, and we'll come back. I will come back to you if I can.
If I may, a lot of work is happening in UK universities on the topic. For example, one of the topics of research at the Turing is counterfactual explanation, which is, I think, a promising area because it seeks to not only explain, but it seeks to give people an understanding of what would I need to change in order to achieve a different outcome. So if I get a counterfactual explanation about a declined loan, it actually tells me, well, if you had more salary or if you had less debt or whatever, you could have met the appropriate criteria. And I must be honest, I think that companies need to be extremely careful about deploying black box models because yes, maybe we miss out on some additional accuracy, but I think the loss of trust through deployment of black box is actually more damaging. And I think we need to work really, really hard at making sure that we can explain how AI does arrive at its conclusions.
Yeah. Anyone want to add to that? Yes, please.
A lot of it isn't black box, like you said. So I think there is black box, and there's a lot that is not. And I think organizations, including my organization, invest a lot in having that explainability because we know that that's important, and quite frankly, to deploy it, that's a necessity.
Two examples of black box. One is principal component analysis, for example. We talk about what are the major factors that will contribute to a particular hypothesis. And then you have the neural network, which means that we can see the input and the output, but nothing in between. So it is getting into what
But the question is how many solutions actually require neural networks, right? As a percentage, right? Is this the biggest problem, or is this or are there smaller fish to fry initially before we overcomplicate things with neural networks? And like you said, it's a balance of pros and cons.
Thank you. A comment from Matthew.
Very briefly, to speak from personal experience, a lot of what we do is in the healthcare space, which means we have a different bar, and it doesn't by any means say this is not important in every area. It clearly is. So I would, just the example you gave of a neural network, it is not completely true empirically that you can only see the input and the output. You can use models to actually see what every single layer of that neural network is doing. You can actually design them, and we have done so. So that, for example, in looking at we've done experiments where we've trained a neural network with historical skin cancer data, image data, and we've looked to see can we predict benign versus malignant tumours by image analysis. and we trained the neural network to do so, and we could see what each layer of that neural network could see and what it was doing. Now, just like if I cut your head open and I said, what's your brain doing? I couldn't tell you what that is, but what I can do is I can say, here's the data that was used to train you, here's how you were educated, here's how you are expected to operate, and here's the control framework we wrap around you to make sure you perform to specification at all times with the bias and the control frameworks we've articulated. So I don't completely agree with you, but I think we have to be very careful. We have a reflex instinct, say black box, black box, black box. We need to be more precise and specific in what we mean here, and articulate that the ability to build traceability into these systems and explainability is entirely possible. And I think the issue is much more, if you take the example which I thought you gave, Stephen, which is very interesting, where someone is refused something and there is no mechanism to finding out why they're refused. That is not a failure of the algorithm. That is a process failure of the institution. They should be able to say how this is run and how it's governed.
Yeah, and in that particular case, they refused to do a manual check.
Or even probably tell them what data was used to train, etc., which should be available.
Fine. I'm conscious you've got more questions, but I'm going to take one over here and then one there, and then perhaps we'll come back to you. So
Tom Hadley from the Recruitment Management Confederation, we're the professional body for the recruitment sector. So our focus and our research is looking at how AI will impact on one of the most important things in people's lives, is how you go about finding a job. So I'm interested to get your views about what's happening now and over the next few years in terms of AI as a selection tool in recruitment.
It's a very good question, and one that was in the news over the weekend, I think. So it's always in the news. Anyone want to?
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating space. And obviously, once again, this comes back to your point, which is a lot of the issues with the space actually come down to if a company's been running a sexist recruitment program for the previous 10 years, then everyone turns around and blames the shiny silver robot man, and actually it's nothing to do. It's to do with the data that goes in that causes the problem. So a lot of these ethical issues actually we're essentially quantifying issues in our broader society and bringing them to the fore in a numerical way, which I think probably makes them ultimately easier to handle and deal with in a broader sense. I think the second thing that's interesting about this is what it does to the value chain. So if you're a big bank, like say Goldman Sachs, who basically your core competitive edge is you recruit the best people. And actually you're now outsourcing a lot of this, your first wave of sort of long list selection to a video tool that is best if it's run across multiple banks, because obviously the data is then bigger and better. You to some extent are shifting and giving away one of your big competitive edges, because you try and do it in-house, the data doesn't work for you. So I think that's one of the many spaces where the potential for AI to explode the value chain and therefore cause the big changes we're talking about is coming down the track very quickly.
Anyone or other panelists want to? Yes,
I'm
please,
just going to say that I think, going back to the data, historically, data in recruiting, especially in certain industries, has been very biased, going to what the best people have historically been. That's debatable. And I think today, especially in the AI space, or what a data scientist is also, I think companies should think a bit differently. I think especially when you look to hire diverse talent, not only in terms of gender, but also in terms of thinking. AI is not just people from computer science. I think people coming from a STEM background or even psychology or behavior can contribute a lot to how these systems are created within an organization. And I'm from STEM myself. I'm not a computer scientist, but having a strong math background is pretty helpful to do AI.
Thank you. Question over here, yes.
Thanks, panelists. I'm Akshay with Shamus. Very interesting thoughts by all the panelists. I really wanted to get your comments on the changing organizational model impact, because we talked about executive leadership, data, but just wanted your thoughts on what needs to be like the future organization model in order to make the best use out of AI. So who needs to talk to who and who needs to come together? Because more and more conversations, we deal with respective stakeholders that lie all over the company. But moving forward, what needs to be the target organization model? Maybe the best practice at AI.
Who wants to? Right?
So I think it's increasingly critical that you have a very strong data science lifecycle deployment methodology that really focuses on process as well as on the technicalities, because you have to have the right points and governance mechanisms in place so that all the deployment of AI is going to be checked along through the process of developing models while the models are in deployment and so forth. So to me, that's the biggest single change will be real stricture around governance through development and deployment.
Can I just add to that as well? Because I 100% agree, but I think there's something which we call shapers, I think Google calls them bridges, which is going from what the business understands to a kind of technical view, if that makes sense.
Yep.
And actually they're in very short supply. So actually people with STEM or STEAM backgrounds who start to understand technology and data science and can provide that bridge over into the business, I think is of huge importance. And we don't have enough of them around, unfortunately.
Yes.
Just one quick thought, which is if you go back to the first big year of digital change, so when the internet first came in, a whole bunch of places brought in chief digital officers to basically make the change happen. Now, those are not jobs that should last forever because clearly you want digital embedded everywhere. I think one of the big questions is, do you want chief AI officers, sometimes data analytics, whatever the titles you want to give them, whose basic job is to help pull these things together and actually give the whole thing a boost to get it to the next level. It's not a job you want in 5-10 years' time, but it might be a short-term bridging job to go for.
Great. I'm going to go over here, and then I'm going to come back to you for a very tiny one, then lady there and over here. Right.
Hi, I'm Eva Marie Müller-Stühler. I'm the Chief Data Scientist for IBM Middle East, Africa and Turkey. And I quickly wanted to say something about the risk because I think we highly underestimate the risk. I pretty much agree with every one of your opinions because everything of one had a valid point. Not everything has to be a neural network. Neural networks are explainable to some degree. But actually, linear regression is not explainable to some degree when you use enough PCA before you do that. But I actually think when we try to make models explainable, we try to over-rely on our explainability. One of the things we're moving towards, especially when it comes to credit risk modeling and so on, we're using more and more behavioral data. So, for example, what time do you check your mobile phone? If you're Muslim, it's absolutely fine if you don't work on Friday to not check your mobile phone on Thursday night at 4 a.m. It doesn't affect your credit risk rating. And vice versa. So it basically is an indicator if you're working Friday or Sunday. So when you go to the explainability, you would see, okay, we use behavioral data, we use the time you check your mobile phone, there is no racial or religious discrimination in it, which actually is, and people don't see that risk. And I think that is why when we say we want our models to be explainable and audited, we need the experience and we need the knowledge and we need to see what have we done in the past and what did we oversee. And I think there's a massive risk of us underestimating the proxies for our behavior and our religious and our biased world.
And therefore diversity.
I think it's a known problem, though. I think it's a known problem, right? You can't discriminate by gender, for instance, but if you look at someone's shopping habits, you could deduct, right? So that's just one more complexity of data. And data is complex. I think it's down to understanding the data, how it was collected, what it was collected for, and maybe what data wasn't collected as well. So I don't think it's something that organizations are necessarily blind to.
I hardly ever see it in practice that people are actually aware of that, if I'm honest.
I think, though, the other build I'd add is a lot of this comes down to people asking the right questions to provide the right explanations. And in my view, that then takes you back to diversity. If the only people who build these things all look the same and speak the same and think the same, this is where you end up. And I'm afraid that, and anyone who knows me knows I bang this drum quite a bit, but we find ourselves in the diversity conversation all the time because if you look at most of the examples which have made the headlines for various reasons, they were generally as a result of people not asking the right questions in the right way to the right people. And that's because the people who built them had a certain mindset and a certain background which didn't recognise those sensitivities, for example.
Thank you. Right, very quick question, because we're running out of time and it would be unfair to...
The second one is from a commercial perspective, hopefully linking back to the legal side, because increasingly we are being sold AI systems by different companies. And it comes back to your point of metadata. This is what they call metadata, right? Not the underlying data. So my question is very much on the supply chain risk, because some companies will come to us and say we have a universal basic machine learning engine in which we can customize based on our hypothesis. And yet when I dig deeper, it seems like that whenever they change the basic engine algorithm underneath, no clients, at least I was told, no clients would ask them to explain or to provide an update. So basically, if I were a company that has bought into a basic machine learning AI engine and build on top of that. And if I don't ask those questions, or if they are not obliged to tell me what has changed in the underlying methodology, I am not informed at all. Should something go into the contract or expectations as what needs to be done about that supply chain risk?
I think it's a very interesting point, but it's actually down to the sophistication of the purchaser of the AI solution. So we see this all the time. So we see very, very unsophisticated approaches to the purchasing of AI, and they just accept what the company tells them, all the way through to a very forensic approach, right at the other end of the scale, where these guarantees are actually built into the contract.
There's something about so many of the AI startups have sold not to the IT department, but to the users, this new shiny toy thing. and that's where the problem comes, I think.
Or executive management.
Or even worse, executive management, yes.
There's undoubtedly a lot of snake oil out there in the market at the moment, for want of a better term.
And I think that was my final point in terms of kind of using third-party components or complete systems, is asking the right questions. So if you're buying a component, there's just some sort of natural language processing that's been trained on American English, and you're buying it for a UK application, have you tested it works there? And just incidentally, in terms of the framework I was talking about earlier, that's quite closely aligned to the European Commission guidelines.
Thank you. Abhijit.
Abhijit Akerkar, Lloyds Banking Group. Billions of dollars or pounds are being invested by companies, and most of your companies have done projections of trillions of dollars of value created over the years, right? When do you think, when is the earliest the year that half a percentage...
They're in the dock, aren't they, really?
When do you think the earliest half a percentage of GDP growth in the UK will come from all these AI investments?
Half a point of GDP. I have to say, I should have brought my chief economist with me to answer that question, I suspect. I am, as Stephen indicated on, I'm slightly more cynical about we need to be careful about how we manage the move to utilising AI and getting the new jobs created. I think we're at risk, actually, of automating away lots of the call centres and shared services, etc., and doing what we've done historically, just hope that people re-skill themselves and move on. So I think there's more of a risk without being proactive management by industries and by government for a negative hit rather than a positive hit. So do I think we'll have people augmented? Yes, but show me an AI company which doesn't come in and go, we're going to augment your people, but your people will therefore be more efficient. Therefore, you either need less people or you're going to have a higher demand. So we're either going to see the economy grow rapidly to meet that demand, or we're going to have less people in organisations. I think for people, when people spin, actually this is going to be not going to replace anybody in your organisation, then don't buy it, because what's the business plan unless it says about quality, and you can suddenly increase revenue. So I think I'm quite cynical, if that makes sense. That's not an official line, by the way, but that's just my opinion.
Tim, give an alternative view.
I'm not going to answer your question directly, but the famous...
You should want to swap places.
The famous quote, obviously, is we can see computers everywhere apart from in the productivity figures. And to some extent, once AI actually really takes off, it will kind of disappear.
Yes.
It'll be like sort of, any digital thing. It enables things to happen, but it itself won't be very hard to pin it down. So it'll be the whole mix of business systems around it. So what proportion of Ocada's value is the AI? Well, hard to calculate. Second thing, I would just go back to my earlier point, which is we do believe there is going to be a dip in this whole thing. So the sort of straight line projections you see, I just don't believe are going to happen. There's going to be a dip coming. We need to manage through that dip. That, for this community, is a really big challenge in the next couple of years. If we can get through the dip, then there is a big upside.
And I was going to actually come back to your point, Tim, which I thought you made, which is a very good one, which is the dot-com boom is, in my mind, the exact template we're running through. I personally think we're actually out of the hype, beginning to come out of the hype curve now, and I think we're in the dip, beginning to. And I say that because the questions we're being asked by people buying this stuff are much more sophisticated and much more searching, and that's a sign that people are really thinking about this. And we're not just flogging into C-suite who have got a good idea and all the rest of it. And I think, therefore, any prediction will be wrong, because if any of us had been asked at the sort of beginning of the dot-com thing or during it what we actually thought the world would look like 15, 20 years later, we'd have all been way out of whack, and we will be this time.
Absolutely. Right. And our final question is the lady at the back there, and we have 1 minute to ask the question and answer it.
Yeah, really quickly. My name's Anna Digley. I work for an American startup AI company called Spark Cognition, scale up, I should say. We've been talking about the importance of questions that the procurement people should be asking, I suppose, because we often find the case where senior executives are really excited. The science project, the fun projects you're talking about, they're on board in, but the middle person is actually very capacity tight in it. They can't evaluate 10 different AI companies coming with this magic answer. So what do you think should be the key question of procurement, or this middle person should ask the AI companies to fully understand whether they have got the right solution for them or not? How should they procure the right AI?
So one quick observation, they should procure it like they procure everything else. They should not be afraid to challenge every single assumption. They should go through every line item, just like they do on us. But that's what they should be doing. And I think any glossy brochure that says, here's the magic box and the fairy dust and the shiny commitments and promises, you challenge it just like any other technology solution that's put in front of you. I think there's a little bit of people are sometimes reticent to do that because they think they don't have the expertise to challenge. But I was very pleased to see what Kate says. I'm a STEM background. I'm not a deep data scientist. I can just about cope with what my lot are up to, give or take. And I think procurement teams should be empowered to do the same. And
the only thing I'd add to that, Matthew, though, is they need to understand that it's a probability system and not a black and white system, which I think...
Which is fair, yeah. And not everyone likes that.
Yeah. Other than that, I completely agree.
Right. Thank you very much. I think, on that point, wrap things up.
I just wanted to say that I thought that one of the interesting aspects, far from being able to sum up what has been said today, but it does demonstrate we've still got a heck of a long way to go before business really is in a position to adopt, to understand all the consequences and implications of adopting AI. And I thought rather reassuringly for our panellists, it demonstrated that actually expert professional advice might still be required.
Well, we certainly hope so, don't we, Tim?
Reassuringly expensive.
Absolutely. Well, I think on that note, we'll draw things to a close. Can I thank all of our speakers this evening? I think there's been an excellent panel, a diverse range of views, cover an awful lot of ground. I've got questions coming out of my ears that I've never got round to asking, but that's the nature of these things. And that's why I think there is still very much an awful lot of work for this particular all-party group to do and to explore this subject and to hopefully inform Parliament and the wider interested AI community. So thank you, all of you, for your contribution to that this evening. Thank you all for the attendance. Sorry about the lack of seating, but there's not a lot I can do about that around this place. Rooms are always in great demand and short supply. So apologies, but hopefully the content of the meeting has made up for that. So hopefully we will see you all again very soon. Thank you.
Very smooth.